Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you this week, skin cancer therapies, or specifically a skin cancer therapy using vaccines to interfere with the ability of cancer to spread and grow. Scientists claim to have found a way to make coffee taste better, although arguably unnecessarily so. Any coffee is good coffee. Unusual signals detected by AI in some of the masterpieces by Raphael, and a update to the list of predatory journals, a replacement to Beale's list. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with skin cancer. Skin cancer by itself is perhaps one of the most dangerous possible cancers out there. It largely gets neglected by individuals with it, and the risk of developing cancer itself is relatively high, especially if you spend any extensive time outside, whether that is sunbathing or you have an outside job that requires that you have skin exposed to sunlight for extended periods. The vaccine by Madonna builds to some extent on things like the COVID-19 vaccines, as it's relying on messenger RNA or mRNA. The key here is that you want to be able to stop cancer from not only proliferating, that is the cells dividing and spreading, but you also want to stop it from happening in the first place. If you can't manage those two, then the next best option is to find a way to allow the immune system to target the cancer cells, which is why cancer spreads the way it does. It's simply unable to be identified by the immune system. Functional benefits aside, it's the actual real-world results that are kind of important. The real-world data shows that when you use this treatment, along with another medication that's used, you can reduce the risk of recurrence or death by 49%. So for all intents and purposes, we can say it halves the risk. There's also the fact that the effect of doing this earlier reduces the probability of a fatal development of the cancer by 62%. While this treatment can do nothing for furries as a cancer, it can at least treat skin cancer, or largely melanomas in this case. The key to this vaccine, as compared to others, is much the same as with the COVID-19 vaccine. The mRNA within it contains the necessary genes and gene sequences to produce up to 34 antigens. These antigens are what allow the immune system to recognize that this is a skin cancer and it needs to be attacked. We should point out, however, that the phase 2 trial as it is now had a relatively small cohort, but compared to the overall population for skin cancer, it's reasonably and relatively standard sized of 157 patients. For those patients to get this result, they did need to have the vaccine roughly every 3 weeks or once a month, and this was done for an entire year. As a result, this is not a one-and-done treatment like the COVID-19 vaccine is to an extent. As such, it's more a conjunctive treatment than a primary treatment. And next we have a similar sort of development, but this time focusing on the GI tract and the microbes within it. The researchers claim, based on a rodent model, so I take it with a lot of salt, that the microbes or bacteria within our GI tract are producing a certain, let's say, chemicals, and these are what lead to weight gain, or in the end result obesity, but well before then simply weight gain. The researchers believe that this is let's say a two-part problem. One is that the actual chemical itself should be interfering with a particular receptor within the GI tract called the PPAR-Y2 receptor. This is going to be involved in the transfer of lipids from the GI tract into the bloodstream. When you have the chemical, which is called phenolic acid, present, it will block the fat moving from the intestines into the bloodstream. However, in children who are particularly exposed to antibiotics and similar, there is a much higher probability that the bacteria that produce this get wiped out regularly. As a result, those children wind up in a situation where they don't have that blockage occurring. Moving on to news that arguably is slightly more useful on a day-to-day basis. How to make your coffee better. Yeah, this is one of those ones where you may or may not find it useful depending on whether or not you view coffee as simply a means of being caffeinated, or if you're going to actually enjoy the coffee and possibly be a snob about it. This doesn't involve any of the more ridiculous notions. You can use it for anything. You don't need the most freshly roasted coffee beans, weird and obscure types, or your own particular hipster's supply line. Instead, all you need to do is take your coffee beans and add just a small amount of water to them before you grind them. The reason the researchers believe this will make the coffee better is that it prevents static electricity building up during the grinding process. This static electricity would otherwise cause the beans that have been ground, and as a result the coffee grind, to clump together. This would prevent a certain amount of passage of the water and a few other issues. The way this could be more useful for some than others is, first of all, that the darker the roasted bean, and arguably as a result the more strongly flavoured the coffee bean is, the more likely they are to create more static, and from that you'll get them clumping together more. In that situation, slightly moistening the beans themselves before grinding will help considerably in not just reducing the friction, but as a result of reducing the friction, reducing the static charge, thereby ensuring water can move more freely through your ground beans. Where this gets somewhat interesting is the relationship between their findings and, let's say, environmental findings. The environmental findings being that within volcanic plumes and to an extent thunderclouds, you get a similar phenomena, and you can apply some of the same concepts to these. The mass to charge ratio, basically. That is, the more, let's say, solid the mass is, and in this case that occurs because you roast the bean for longer, thereby driving more water out of it, you get a higher charge because there's more friction as you break down the parts of the coffee bean. This creates more static charge. Again, going back to the volcanic plumes as an example, and even thunderclouds. Shifting from practical news to news that's probably not going to be able to be resolved any time in the near or even distant future. How the government tends to drive certain businesses practically to death, and in this instance it's the cannabis industry. As weird as it is to say, there's the irony in legalizing cannabis, but the legalization has been so completely covered and wrapped up in red tape that it's incredibly hard to not just get into the business, but for the business to operate. One of the problems is simply excise taxes, something that prior to legalization wasn't really a problem. Drug dealers don't tend to pay taxes for some strange reason. The excise tax is relatively similar for things like alcohol, tobacco, and even fuel. Unfortunately, for the cannabis industry, it's not only a relatively high ratio compared to these other products, but also it's really impossible to get around. Whereas something like the fuel industry tends to get regular relief from the government, as has been the case in recent months and years with the cost of living going ever up, the cannabis industry doesn't get that relief. This does, however, mean that in Canada, for example, the cannabis industry does produce more than $1.5 billion annually in federal taxes. If assuming that they can use that money wisely, they would be able to produce considerable benefits. Of course, this is the government. The chances of them doing so are fairly minor. This is why, and we should be very clear about it, you shouldn't rely on this data necessarily, surveys of 122 producers within Canada was able to show that they send between 20 and 35% of their sales revenue in taxes to the government. One of the major reasons for this is that the excise is a static rate, that is, it does not change no matter what. Whereas with others, it's basically sold on the premise of here is the amount of fuel cost, here is the relative amount or percentage of tax. They don't do that with cannabis. And cannabis is a flat rate of, this is the cost in dollars per gram. That obviously creates a problem. When you have fluctuations in the price of cannabis, and as has been the case over the last few years, a continuous decrease in the cost, it's nearly impossible to try and maintain that rate. This will inevitably lead to one of two outcomes. Either the price of basic products will have to go up to compensate for this, and this will likely lead to the second outcome, that being that the legalization of cannabis will simply lead to an increase in the illicit sale of cannabis, as those who are selling it illegally do not need to pay any of these extra costs, whether it is licensing, excise, or more. In a completely different vein of news, we have AI being trained to try and detect the differences in artwork. Not actually AI. Calling this AI is frustrating. It's machine learning. The idea here is that researchers are able to train a algorithm on various artworks that are known to be done by certain artists. In this instance, we're talking about Raphael in particular, and the reason why this is useful is that it brings to light a certain amount of clarification around one painting in particular. It's the Madonna della rosa, or Madonna of the Rose if you wish to use English. The painting has had a somewhat controversial history, largely owing to the fact that some experts don't believe it was done by Raphael, others do. The work was able to provide some clarity as to why that is. The first reason is that as a whole, when they trained their machine learning algorithm, it found that the painting was inconclusive, but when they ran it against the three faces on the right and bottom left, that being the Madonna, the Child, and St. John, all of these are found to have been a Raphael work. However, the final person, St. Joseph, was not. And what is thought instead is that it may well be the case that that face was painted by one of Raphael's students, Giulio Romano, but again, not entirely sure. After all, it's artwork. It's unlikely that everything was done at exactly the same time and same way. At the same time, it is unlikely that Raphael woke up one morning with a hangover and decided to phone it in either. Next we go to technology news, but also astronomy, and talking about NASA's plan to send a probe to the Sun. And given that this is being touted as touching the Sun, we hope they've asked for consent first. Touching random celestial objects and pissing them off is not a great idea, especially the Sun. What's important here is that the probe itself will not actually get in contact with the Sun, which is why the headlines are kind of stupid. Instead, it's passing through the star's atmosphere, and by doing that, we can sample some of it and get an idea as to what the great big ball of fire in the sky is actually doing at that particular moment in that particular place. The major, let's say, discoveries they're looking to find are about the different kinds of waves that occur within the Sun, the various solar winds that are moving around it, and whether or not the associated heating is a driving or derived factor when it comes to it. The final news we have for you this week is an update to a list of predatory journals from 2023. The idea here is fairly straightforward. If you are going to publish research results, you need to find a way that would allow you to disseminate it reliably. Now, the biggest challenge for most academics is paying for that publication to an extent. It can be anywhere upwards of $5,000 or more per an article, so it's not an insignificant amount. If you're going to take that much money, you need to have it, and in some cases, that's just not possible. Predatory journals tend to offer significantly greater savings, somewhere often less than $500. What they sacrifice to do so is pretty much everything that makes a journal worth reading. That is, peer review and editing. Instead, most of the time, they might as well just take whatever you've written, put it into a PDF and post it online. It's something you can do yourself with a blog post. This is the problem, and unfortunately, not all predatory journals are easy to identify, nor are they necessarily going to really do much even if they're called out. The upside for some people is that because there is absolutely no quality control or standards, they will publish anything and everything as long as you pay them their money. This is why a lot of deceptive, dodgy, or just outright fraudulent research gets published, even though it should never have seen the light of day given what it is and what is generally going to be incredibly poor methodological processes, something to the effect of results that can't be relied on, and other issues that simply get ripped to pieces by academics once they see this work. One of the easiest ways to be able to identify these predatory publishers was Jeffrey Beall's list of predatory publishers, unsurprisingly. Unfortunately, he came under a lot of pressure, both from the university he was at and by the predatory journals themselves suing him. As a result, he basically shut down that process. However, his list was available for a time afterwards, and another team has picked up what's going on and are running it and providing the same information, and to an extent an updated list. There is one point that does need to be made about this before finishing up. That is, not all predatory journals will always be predatory journals. Some of them have started out with very questionable and dubious pasts, but have managed to prove themselves to be worth publishing within. But they are the exception to the rule, whereas just about everything else has just continued the same practices of being a cash cow that, the publishers can milk by pressuring desperate researchers to publish or perish. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.